Paul Maynard.
Thank you, Mr Robertson, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Wigan on a very compelling and powerful speech, even if I didn't quite agree with everything she said, but such is life. I don't wish to preempt my 10-minute rule bill next Tuesday, which I recommend to you all, but just a few preliminary comments. All of us around these tables will know how much value the concessionary fares are by our constituents, even if we do tend to argue over it at election time. But there does seem to me to be one particular imbalance that needs to be addressed. If you are an able-bodied pensioner who can use the buses, you get your concessionary fare. If you are a disabled pensioner who cannot use the buses and has to rely on dial-a-ride services or demand responsive services or other community transport, you have to pay your own way. And that seems to me to be a glaring imbalance that no doubt runs contrary to the spirit of the legislation intended by the party opposite when they introduced it, but an imbalance nonetheless. I do understand that certain councils choose to give disabled free transport, but not every council does. And with the increasing budgetary pressures, I do fear that fewer and fewer will. The imbalance to me seems not only unfair, but actually contrary to the spirit of both equality and human dignity. And whilst I realise it's a spending commitment, no doubt frowned upon, many of the pensioners who contact me who say, I don't need the card, I'm wealthy enough to pay myself. I do make the point, you can always pay your own way. No one is forcing you to have a card. But equally, I do believe that my constituents in Blackpool do not deserve to be treated differently from my constituents in Wyre, and everyone should have the same rights to free transport and free travel. And any member wishing to support my bill can see me at the end, and I will add their names. Now, one of the great honours of being here as an MP is the ability to chair the APPG on young disabled people, whose secretariat is wonderfully provided by the Muscular Dystrophy campaign. Now, I'm not a great fan of the APPG system as a whole. Far too many seem to be vanity projects or excuses to go to obscure countries I've never even heard of. But nonetheless, when I was approached, I made the point, I will be the chairman on one condition, that it's meaningful. I want to see outcomes, I want to see processes, I want to see reports. I don't just want to sit around talking about the problems, I want to hear what we can do about them. And that's certainly what I got. Report number 1 of the Inclusion Now series of reports is actually called End of the Line. Now, I will leave to one side the fact that they copied the Conservative Party's report on coastal towns, which had the same title, and which is now in the bottom drawer of the government, I fear. But, you know, I welcome it nonetheless because it does say what happens to very many disabled people. They want to get off at a station. They arrive at the station, but no one is there to help them get off. They find they reach the end of the line, often many stations away, simply because no one will help them get off. Now, the report was followed by a public hearing of the APPG. We invited lots of transport providers along, and I made the point at the start of the meeting that I did not want negativity. I did not want just to hear the bad, because, as the Honourable Member for Wigan pointed out, we have made strides. If all we ever do is tell those train companies and bus companies and taxi companies what they're doing wrong, I don't think we really encourage them to keep trying to fix what is right. And luckily, we did have a positive, to fix what is wrong, and notice I got that wrong briefly. Some of the dreadful cases that came to light were actually buses pulling away sharply with wheelchairs skidding everywhere and passengers with imbalance issues sent flying. The assisted passenger registration service limits the spontaneity of people because they have to give 24 hours notice. If I had to give 24 hours notice about where I wanted to go, I'm not sure I could actually manage to live my life as it is. As the Honourable Member pointed out, accessibility issues at stations. I know they are elderly buildings. I know they have been around a long time. But with a bit of creativity and a bit of thought, I'm sure solutions could be found. Perhaps the most controversial issue was staff awareness. Examples of where individual members of staff have not met the standards their own companies expect. Now, this is a very difficult issue, in my view, because many think that that just means they need more training. I take a slightly more libertarian view, perhaps, in that I don't believe we can control what occurs in people's minds. I would love to be able to make them all think the way they ought to think, but that can't happen. But what I think does need to happen is that when those cases do occur, every disabled person who suffers actually has the confidence to enter into the complaint process, knowing they will be listened to and knowing that they won't just be dismissed. We can't have passengers being left on trains. We can't have staff members ignoring them at stations. We can't have that sort of attitude. But we also have to recognise that we have a problem with the elderly nature of many of our trains, buses and so on these days. I often travel into Manchester by train from Preston on what is essentially a bus on wheels. It's older than me, I suspect, and it's perhaps unrealistic to expect that to have all the knobs and flashing buttons that a modern new train might have that would enable, say, passengers to draw attention to the fact that at this particular door, there is a disabled passenger trying to get off, and that might ease it for members of staff, perhaps. I also like to pay tribute to National Express, who I think do an excellent job in providing for disabled people. I realise there are issues regarding the government's funding of coach services at the moment that might threaten some of those subsidies. I better not go there, but I have pointed out to National Express that actually, why don't they introduce a 50% reduction card themselves? If they're getting so many disabled passengers, I'm sure they will keep getting them if they introduce that card under their own steam. Honourable Member for Wigan also mentioned the abolition of the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee and was rather critical of that abolition. I'm afraid I don't share her criticism. I realise we're having a Quango call. Lots of worthy bodies are disappearing, but I would point out that the idea is that Equality 2025, based in the Home Office, will absorb those responsibilities. And I think actually, if you place it within a wider equality framework, it might be more effective at achieving the goals the Honourable Lady points out. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want negativity. So let me point out a success from the Trailblazers campaign. Carrie-Anne Fleming, who lives in Kendal, often has to wait an hour at a bus stop for the right disabled access bus to come along that she can actually get on. And she thought that wasn't good enough. So she launched a campaign and she fought really hard. And just this once, a local government listened to someone complaining about something. It very rarely happens, I find, but we managed it here. And now they're going to alter the timetables to make sure that she can get on a bus and doesn't have to wait an hour. Now, I'd like to close with a paean of praise for the idea of human dignity, which I think suffers on public transport. 47% of disabled people experience some form of abuse on public transport. That's according to Alice Maynard of Scope. No relation. I'm not sure who's more relieved about that, me or her. Nonetheless, even I have experienced it. I take a bus to the station each morning on my way here. I'm often a bit groggy at 7 a.m, I'm afraid to say, a bit woolly-headed, and I don't always keep my balance when the bus driver puts his foot down and roars off from the bus stop, and I'll go flying. And just this once, I crashed into a lady, business lady, who wasn't very happy about it. I apologised, I explained that my balance is by no means perfect and I do struggle on buses, and she said, well, you shouldn't be on the bus if you can't stand up straight. And I just went, I beg your pardon? I couldn't quite believe that, because actually I have as much right to be on the bus as she does. It's not called able-bodied transport, it's called public transport. That means we should all be able to use it, not just the able-bodied. So thank you for your attention.